Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we are traveling back to a time when darkness was not just the absence of light, it was something people truly feared. A time when the line between the living and the dead felt thin, and the sound of a shovel in a quiet graveyard could make hearts stop. Welcome back to my series of living, where old stories rest uneasily beneath the soil of memory. Our tale begins in Eastern Europe among the misty forests and forgotten villages of the Balkans. Here, centuries ago, people lived close to death. Disease, famine, and war were constant visitors. Medicine was primitive, and the causes of illness were unknown. When a loved one died suddenly and another in the same household fell sick soon after, the living searched for an explanation. And in the quiet dread of the night, one name began to whisper through the countryside: the revenant, the one who returned. They called them by many names: vampire, Yupper, Strige, but the fear was the same. It was said that certain souls, restless or cursed, could rise again from their graves to drain the life from those they once loved. In villages without science or medicine, death was mysterious, and so were the signs that followed it. Bodies sometimes appear to move or groan after burial, a result of gases escaping during decomposition. Fresh blood around the mouth, or a corpse that looked strangely full, made people believe the dead had fed on the living. And so the legend grew. Men and women were exhumed, examined by candlelight, and declared guilty of haunting the village. To stop them, people drove wooden stakes through their hearts, or burned the remains to ash. It was not cruelty, it was protection, born from fear and desperation. In these dark corners of Europe, the vampire was never a handsome stranger in a velvet cloak. It was a bloated figure, red and swollen, smelling of decay. It was a face of the unknown, of illness, of grief, of the terror that death might not be the end after all. And from these early whispers of fear, the myth of the vampire began to take shape, not yet romantic, not yet eternal, but human, raw, and very much alive in the imagination of the living. As the centuries passed, the legend of the vampire refused to stay buried. It spread from one valley to the next, carried by traders, soldiers, and storytellers who wander from village to village. In an age before maps or newspapers, stories were the internet of their time, living things that changed with every retelling. From the dense forests of Serbia to the shadowed hills of Transylvania, each region gave the vampire a new name, a new face, and a new meaning. In Romania, people spoke of the strigoi, restless spirits that rose from the grave to torment their families. In Slavic lands, the Yupper became a symbol of corruption, both spiritual and physical. And in Hungary, the tales took on a darker, more tragic note: the belief that those who had suffered injustice in life might return to take what was denied them in death. The spread of these myths followed the same paths as war and disease. Wherever fear traveled, the vampire traveled too. When plague swept across Europe, leaving towns silent and empty, survivors whispered that something unnatural was feeding on the living. When livestock died without reason, villagers spoke of spirits that drained their blood at night. And when graveyards were disturbed, whether by thieves, animals, or the shifting earth, it was easier to believe that the dead had risen and to face how fragile life truly was. What is remarkable is how these stories adapted. In Catholic regions, the vampire became a warning against and a punishment for the impure. In Orthodox areas, it became a restless ghost needing proper burial rites. And in pagan traditions that survived in secret, it was something older still, a spirit of hunger, the shadow side of existence itself. By the 1700s, reports of vampire attacks reached even the polished halls of European courts. Officials wrote investigations, priests performed exorcisms, and foreign scholars took notes in disbelief. What began as folklore in remote villages had become an international obsession. And yet, behind the superstition and the fear, the legend carried something deeper: reflection of the human desire to explain what we cannot see and to believe that even death might not have the final word. To understand why the vampire myth took such deep root, we have to step into a world where death was everywhere. In the centuries before modern medicine, people did not just fear dying, they feared what happened after. A small cough could turn into fever. A fever could sweep through an entire village. And when it did, there was no cure, no explanation, and no comfort beyond faith. Epidemics came in waves: plague, tuberculosis, cholera. Each one left graves filled faster than anyone could count. Bodies were buried quickly, sometimes without a priest, sometimes before people were truly gone. You see, medicine did not yet understand coma or catalepsy. And so, a person who seemed dead might later awaken underground, clawing, gasping, leaving scratch marks on the coffin lid. When villagers later reopened those graves and found the marks, they believed the impossible: the dead had risen. There were other signs that deepened the fear. As bodies decomposed, gases made the abdomen swell, pushing out blood to the mouth and nose. To those who did not know about decay, it looked as though the corpse had fed on the living. When a shovel broke the coffin seal, the sound of escaping air could resemble a low groan of breath from beyond. In their minds, this was proof enough that something unnatural was happening. And so, across Eastern Europe, suspicion spread like the very diseases people were trying to explain. When someone fell sick after a family member's death, it was said the deceased was returning each night to drain their strength. To stop the haunting, graves were opened. The body was examined for fresh blood, and if found, a stake was driven to the heart or the head was removed. The fear was raw, desperate, and painfully human. From our modern point of view, it is easy to see misunderstanding science mixed with superstition. But in a world ruled by hunger, disease, and silence, people needed reasons. They needed to believe that evil could be named, fought, and defeated. And that belief, however dark, gave them a sense of control over death itself. When we picture vampires today, we imagine elegant pale faces, velvet cloaks, and tragic beauty. But the first vampires of history were nothing like that. They were creatures of fear, not fascination. Monsters born from misunderstanding and decay. In the earliest stories, vampires were described as swollen, red-faced corpses. Their skin was not smooth and white, but dark, almost purple, the color of trapped blood. Their eyes bulged. Their nails had grown sharp. Their lips were stained with something that looked like fresh blood. And to those who dug up their graves, it was enough to send shivers through generations. These vampires did not live in castles or dance under chandeliers. They lurked in fields, barns, and graveyards. They were said to crawl from the earth at night, heavy and slow, searching for warmth. Some legends claimed they could knock on the doors of their former homes. If a family answered, misfortune would soon follow. Others said that cattle grew weak or died after a vampire had passed by their pasture. People feared them not just because of how they looked, but because of what they represented: disease, corruption, and the loss of control. The vampire was a body that refused to stay dead. It broke the order of the world, and that was terrifying. To villagers who lived by faith and ritual, the vampire was proof that something had gone terribly wrong in the natural cycle. Stories told of strange behaviors too. Some said vampires could not cross running water. Others believed they could not enter a home unless invited. Many thought they avoided sunlight because it revealed their true, bloated form. Garlic, iron, and holy symbols were used to keep them away, small acts of hope against overwhelming fear. It is striking how little romance there was in these early tales. No tragic love, no eternal longing. Just survival of the living against the restless dead. The vampire was not yet a poetic symbol of forbidden desire. It was a warning, a reflection of death's stubborn presence in everyday life. And from this raw, ugly image, the bloated corpse, the open grave, the silent terror, the idea of the vampire began its long, dark transformation toward the creature we know today. In the old villages of Eastern Europe, fear did not end when the grave was filled. Even after a funeral, people still watched the shadows carefully. They believed that if the proper steps were not taken, the dead could come back. And so, over centuries, entire traditions were built around one desperate goal: to make sure the dead stayed buried. The rituals began before burial. If a person had lived a strange or sinful life, their body was treated with caution. Sometimes iron nails were driven into the coffin lid to pin the spirit inside. In some regions, stones were placed under the corpse's tongue or across its chest. Others scattered poppy seeds or sand in the grave, believing the restless dead would be forced to count every grain, wasting the night until sunrise. Garlic became a sacred protection. It was not just used in food, it was rubbed on doors, windows, and even on the skin of children. Some placed it in the mouth of the deceased, sealing them against evil. The smell, strong and bitter, was thought to drive away spirits and demons alike. If fear spread after a burial, if livestock died, or illness returned, the villagers would gather again. At night, under flickering torches, they would dig up the grave. A priest might stand nearby, whispering prayers. The crowd would hold its breath as the coffin opened. If the body seemed too fresh or the mouth stained red, they believed their suspicions confirmed. What came next was grim but purposeful. A wooden stake, often made of ash or hawthorn, was driven through the heart. Some burned the body to ashes. Others cut off the head and buried it between the legs. Each act had meaning: to break the connection between body and spirit, to restore peace to the living. These rituals were not born of cruelty. They were born of fear and of love. Love for the family still breathing, for the village still standing. People wanted to believe they could defend themselves against the unseen. And in doing so, they turned terror into ritual, and ritual into tradition. Not all vampire stories were whispers told around the fire. Some were written down in reports, diaries, and government documents. And those records show something haunting: that whole villages once believed vampires were real. One of the earliest and most famous cases came from Serbia in the 1700s. In a small village called Kiseljevo, a man named Petar Blagojevic died suddenly. Only days later, people claimed to see him walking through the streets at night. They said he had knocked on doors, calling out to his neighbors by name. Each person he called on was found dead soon after. Panic spread quickly. Villagers begged the authorities to act. A priest and an Austrian military officer came to investigate. When they opened Petar's grave, they found the body strangely intact. The skin looked fresh. The mouth was smeared with blood. To those standing in that cold graveyard, there was no doubt the vampire legend had come to life. The officer wrote a detailed report and sent it to Vienna. It caused a sensation across Europe. Soon, vampire hunts were being carried out in other villages. In one case, in Medu-Egna, 9 corpses were exhumed and burned because villagers believed they had been feeding on the living. These were not stories told by children. They were official actions, documented by soldiers and priests. To modernize, it sounds almost impossible. But to the people of that time, it was an act of protection. Science was young. Death was mysterious. And fear filled every empty space that knowledge had not yet reached. Even high society began to take notice. Pamphlets and newspapers printed the reports. Europe's philosophers debated whether vampires could exist. The word vampire entered Western languages for first time. And suddenly, what had been a local superstition in remote villages became a European obsession. The vampire had escaped the grave not just in legend, but in print. And with ink instead of blood, it began to spread across the world. By the late 1700s, the world had begun to change. Science was rising. Empires were expanding. And yet, deep inside the human heart, the old fears refused to fade. The vampire, once a creature of mud and superstition, was about to be reborn not in a graveyard, but on the page. Writers of the Romantic era found something haunting in the legend. They no longer saw the vampire as a corpse crawling from the dirt, but as a soul cursed to live forever, lonely, doomed, and beautiful in its suffering. It was no longer a monster to fear, it was a mirror of human pain. In 1819, the story The Vampire by John Polidori was published in London. It shocked readers. Here was no peasant ghoul, but nobleman pale, mysterious, moving among society with charm and danger. He fed not only on blood, but on trust and love. This new vampire was seductive, intelligent, and unforgettable. He marked the beginning of the Gothic transformation. Then came others. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla gave the myth a chilling, intimate beauty. And in 1897, Bram Stoker's Dracula would give it immortality. Stoker's Count was elegant and terrifying, crossing oceans and centuries. He could command wolves, vanish into mist, and speak with a strange, ancient sadness. He was not just undead, he was timeless. Through these stories, the vampire changed shape again. It became a symbol of temptation, isolation, and the hunger that lives inside every human being. The setting shifted from wooden villages to candlelit castles, from crude superstition to psychological fear. The stake was replaced by suspense, and the graveyard by moonlight. Readers were no longer horrified by rot and decay. They were haunted by emotion, by the thought of never dying, yet never belonging. The vampire became an outcast who longed for meaning, trapped between life and death. And in that loneliness, people recognized something of themselves. What had once been a warning in folklore had become poetry, dark, tragic, and strangely beautiful. The vampire had entered literature, and from there would never truly die. By the 20th century, the vampire had become more than a story. It was a mystery that scientists, doctors, and historians wanted to solve. How could so many people, across so many centuries, believe in the same creature? Surely there had to be something real beneath the legend, something hidden in the human body itself. And so, a strange idea began to take shape. Maybe the vampire was not born from magic or curses. Maybe it was born from disease. In the mid-1900s, researchers began to link the old myths to a rare genetic disorder called porphyria. It is a condition that affects how the body produces heme, a vital part of blood. When the process goes wrong, it can cause painful and frightening symptoms. Skin becomes extremely sensitive to sunlight, blistering at the slightest touch of daylight. Teeth can appear reddish because of the buildup of pigments in the blood. The skin grows pale. The eyes seem to glow under dim light, and in severe cases, the person avoids daylight completely. To scientists looking at folklore, this sounded familiar. A pale figure who hides from the sun. A person whose teeth seem unnaturally red. Someone who grows weak without blood, or at least without the iron inside it. It was tempting to connect these dots and say, perhaps this was where the vampire myth began. Some even noticed that people with porphyria sometimes felt relief after receiving blood transfusions. It was not feeding, it was medicine. But to the fearful eyes of history, it might have looked like something else entirely. Still, not everyone agreed. Many doctors pointed out that porphyria could not explain every part of the legend. The disorder is rare, and it does not cause the violent behavior or supernatural strength that folklore describes. It may have inspired the image, they said, but not the myth itself. Yet the theory stayed elegant, haunting, and strangely fitting. It reminded people that the line between science and superstition is thinner than we like to admit, that sometimes a legend begins not with a curse, but with an illness and with a fear of what we do not understand. Imagine living centuries ago, long before doctors or diagnoses with condition no one could explain. Your skin burns at the touch of sunlight. Your gums recede, making your teeth look longer, sharper. Your reflection fades, not from mirrors, but from isolation and fear. To your neighbors, you are no longer quite human. And that, perhaps, is how a legend is born. Porphyria is a family of disorders, each affecting the blood in different ways. When the body fails to process heme correctly, toxins build up. The skin becomes hypersensitive. Even the smallest exposure to sunlight causes pain, blistering, cracking, bleeding. Over time, scars form. The face tightens, the lips pull back, the teeth appear red in the glow of candlelight. Those who suffered often stayed indoors, hiding behind shutters, wrapped in darkness for protection. The similarity to the vampire's behavior was uncanny. Avoiding sunlight, living by night, pale, weak, and drawn to shadows. Even garlic, a common cure, in folklore seemed to fit, because certain compounds in garlic can worsen porphyria symptoms by affecting the same enzymes involved in blood chemistry. So a patient might truly grow sick after eating it. To villagers watching, this was proof of something unholy. Some cases were even more tragic. Without modern treatment, pain and madness often followed. Hallucinations, anxiety, and bursts of rage were common in severe attacks. To a frightened community, this could look like possession or the hunger of something no longer human. Over time, these small truths wove themselves into the tapestry of myth. The symptoms became symbols. The medical became magical. The sufferer became the monster. It was not cruelty, it was confusion, fear, and the desperate need to explain what could not be seen. Today, doctors understand porphyria far better. It is treatable, though still rare, but its shadow remains in the imagination. When we picture the vampire, we see pieces of those who once suffered in silence, the pale skin, the hidden rooms, the fear of the sun. Science may have named the illness, but the legend still whispers its old name, the child of darkness, forever thirsting for light. As science advanced, fascination slowly gave way to doubt. The porphyria theory had captured imaginations, but doctors began to ask difficult questions. Could a rare blood disorder really explain a legend so old, so widespread, and so complex? The more they studied, the less certain the answer became. For one, porphyria is uncommon, extremely uncommon. It affects only a handful of people out of millions. Yet vampire myths appeared across Europe, from the Balkans to Britain, and even in parts of Asia and Africa. How could one illness create so many stories in so many different places? It did not add up. And while porphyria causes light sensitivity and pale skin, it does not cause the behaviors described in folklore. Those who suffered did not rise from graves or crave blood or transform at night. They were sick, not supernatural. The redness of their teeth and the fragility of their skin were symptoms, not signs of hunger or evil. Science, precise and patient, stripped away the mystery and found something deeply human underneath. Other explanations also began to surface. Anthropologists suggested that the vampire was never about one disease, but about death itself, about how people understood decay before science. Historians pointed to social reasons, fear of outsiders, of epidemics, of those who did not fit in. The vampire was a way to personify what communities feared most: contagion, corruption, and loss. Doctors agreed that porphyria might have inspired part of the image. But it could not be the whole story. Real medical cases could explain only a few details: pale skin, fear of sunlight, the garlic connection, not the mythology of eternal life, or blood drinking. As one researcher wrote, science can explain the symptoms, but not the soul of the legend. And maybe that is the truth that matters most. The vampire is not just a medical curiosity. It is a cultural mirror reflecting what each age fears, desires, and refuses to face. Medicine can tell us what porphyria is, but only imagination can tell us why we keep dreaming of creatures that walk between life and death, forever searching for what they have lost. If science can't explain the vampire completely, perhaps the answer lies somewhere deeper inside the human mind, because at its heart, the vampire myth has always been about fear. Not just the fear of death, but the fear of what comes after. And maybe, too, the fear of what lives inside us. For centuries, people lived in a world they could not control. Storms, plagues, and famine could destroy everything in a single season. Loved ones vanished overnight, carried away by illness or war. When life feels fragile, imagination becomes a form of survival. Stories become shields, and monsters become explanations. The vampire was a perfect reflection of that uncertainty. It turned the invisible into something visible, something with a face, a name, and a weakness. It made death seem like an opponent that could be fought, staked, or burned. In a strange way, it gave people hope, because if the dead could rise, perhaps life, too, could defy its limits. But there was more than fear at work. Psychologists later noticed how the vampire mirrors our most hidden emotions. It is desire without control. It is hunger that never ends. It is loneliness wrapped in beauty and danger. Every generation reshaped it to fit its own anxieties, from plague to passion, from superstition to psychology. In strict religious societies, the vampire symbolized sin and temptation. In times of war, it became a metaphor for invaders, outsiders feeding on the innocent. In modern stories, it often stands for addiction, trauma, or the fear of aging and loss. It evolves as we do because it comes from us. The myth of the vampire endures not because it is real, but because it is true in a way that myths often are. It speaks to our endless search for meaning in the face of mortality. It whispers that maybe part of us wishes to escape time, even if it costs our humanity. And so, the vampire survives not in graves or castles, but in the quiet corners of the human imagination, where fear and fascination live side by side. And so, after centuries of fear and fascination, the vampire still walks among us, not in graveyards or castles, but in the stories we tell. It has changed faces, accents, and meanings, but it has never truly died, because every age finds itself reflected in those hungry eyes. In the Middle Ages, the vampire was a warning, a lesson carved in superstition. In the Gothic era, it became a tragedy, a lonely soul cursed by immortality. In modern times, it wears many forms, sometimes a hero, sometimes a villain, sometimes both. From the dark corners of literature to glowing television screens, the vampire remains our most adaptable ghost. It feeds on whatever we fear most. Once, that fear was plague and death. Later, it became sexuality, disease, or power. Today, it might be isolation, the quiet ache of being alive in a world too bright, too fast, too temporary. The vampire does not just drink blood. It drinks meaning. It becomes a shape of whatever humanity hides in the dark. Perhaps that is why we can't let it go. It is the myth that grows with us. When science strips away the mystery, art gives it back again. When faith fades, fiction keeps the flame. It reminds us that to live forever might not be a blessing, that immortality without love is just another kind of death. Even now, When we turn off the lights and scroll through stories, the vampire waits silent, patient, eternal. It is there in every tale of obsession, every image of beauty that hides decay, every moment when we wonder what it means to be human. Maybe the vampire has survived so long because it was never really about monsters at all. It was always about us, our hunger, our loneliness, our wish to be remembered after the light goes out. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, let the legend rest beside you, not to frighten, but to remind that even the darkest myths are only shadows of the living, and that within those shadows, the human heart still beats quietly, endlessly, waiting for dawn. And so, our journey ends where it began, in the quiet space between life and death, between fear and understanding. We have wandered through misty villages of Eastern Europe, where superstition turned grief into legend. We have seen how the living tried to make sense of decay, how ritual became protection, and how stories became memory. From the red-faced corpses of forgotten cemeteries to the noble vampires of Gothic literature, the myth has changed, yet its heart remains the same. It is a pulse of every era's fear, beating just beneath the skin of the story, whether through the eyes of terrified peasants or the lens of modern science. Humanity has always searched for a reason, a pattern, a way to give shape to the unknown. Porphyria gave us one answer, medicine another. But perhaps the truth lies not in blood or bone, but in imagination. Because a vampire, in all its forms, is simply as our reflection in the dark, our longing to control what cannot be controlled. It is the echo of mortality, whispering that everything we fear about death comes from how fiercely we love life. So tonight, as the story fades and silence returns, let that thought rest with you. The vampire may be eternal, but so is wonder. And the fact that we still tell this tale, centuries later, means that part of us still listens for footsteps in the night, not out of terror, but out of curiosity. Thank you for joining me tonight. Until next time, sleep well, dream softly, and remember, even in the darkest stories, the heart of humanity still shines quietly beneath the shadow.